Hi, and welcome to this special edition of the Center for Post-Christendom Studies Roundtable. I'm glad to be here today with Dr. Kevin Flatt, who is the Associate Professor of History and Director of Research at Redeemer University in Ancaster, Ontario. I'm Dr. Lee Beach, one of the co-directors of the Center for Post-Christendom Studies and Associate Professor of Christian Ministry at McMaster Divinity College. We're here today to talk about a study that Kevin and a couple of his colleagues, David Haskell and Stephanie Bourgogne, have been a part of, a study about mainline churches in Southern Ontario, Canada, a study that's been unearthed some very interesting results and has been widely published under the title of Theology Matters. It was published in the Review of Religious Research in its December issue, but also was picked up widely by a number of media outlets. Maclean's Magazine, which is a major news magazine here in Canada, as well as the Washington Post and the Guardian in the UK, which is indicative of some of the interesting data and results that this study has produced. And I'm glad to have you with us today, Kevin, to talk a little bit about that. First, maybe tell us what prompted the interest in studying mainline churches, as particularly looking at the difference between those that are growing and those that weren't growing.
So Dave Haskell and I have been working on mainline Protestant churches for quite a few years. We've done a bunch of different studies. And one of the things for anybody who's familiar with mainline Protestant churches in Canada that you notice right away is that most of these churches are shrinking. And the denominations as a whole have been shrinking for more than half a century now. But there are a few that are growing. And that's interesting. And so we had this idea, I think, for quite a while that we wanted to look at those churches that are growing and try to figure out what makes them tick. What's different about the growing churches as compared to the more typical churches which are shrinking?
And what did you learn? I mean, this is really one of the key sort of things of post-Christendom. We see this general decline of mainline churches. But what were some of the things that you learned from the study?
The really big finding for us is that the growing churches tended to be much more theologically conservative than the declining churches. And that's something that has been found by some other researchers, but then other researchers have disputed it. And so we wanted to see in a Canadian context, if you compare within the same denominations, the same group of denominations, these growing and these declining churches, are there theological differences? And we found there are very big theological differences. And those differences are most pronounced among the clergy. The clergy are kind of at the extremes, or the most polarized. So the clergy of the growing churches are the most theologically conservative group. Then the clergy of the declining churches are the least theologically conservative. And the congregations are sort of in between, leaning to one side or the other, but not as polarized as the clergy are.
So you alluded, and we'll come back to some of that, but you alluded to other studies. So there's been other studies similar to the ones that you and your colleagues have done.
That's right. There hasn't been anything quite like this in Canada that we're aware of, but there have been a lot of studies done in the United States and in the United Kingdom, some of which are really big studies, national level studies with hundreds or even thousands of congregations in them. And some of these have found that same result. And the historical studies tend to find this pattern as well, that the more theologically conservative churches fare better over time. But some of the sociological studies that have taken a snapshot have argued that, in fact, theology doesn't matter, that those differences aren't important. And when we looked into those studies a little bit more closely, what we found is their approach to determining the theological orientation of a church used a pretty blunt instrument, which is they asked one person in the church, typically the lead clergy person, a question like, how liberal or conservative is your church? Which is a fairly subjective question, and it depends a lot on your context and your perceptions of things. And you're only asking one person. And we actually know from other research that one informant in a congregation usually does a pretty poor job of capturing the reality of that whole congregation. And so our approach, we think, was a more fine-tuned approach, which is we went to not only the clergy, but also the people in the congregations, everybody who was there on a Sunday service, And we asked them not just how liberal or conservative are you or something like that, but we asked them, how strongly do you agree or disagree with this whole list of statements about specific theological beliefs? And then we use that as the basis for understanding what's happening theologically in these churches.
Yeah. So maybe let's move to a little bit of interpretation of the data. How do you interpret what you found, particularly thinking in terms of the mainline church in light of post-Christendom realities and things like that? What would be some of the ways that you kind of have interpreted the data that you found?
I'm a historian by training. And so I tend to think of things in a longer term view. And in Canada, like in a lot of other Western countries, if you go back to, say, the 1950s, there's a situation where there's a social expectation of having a connection to a church. And to some degree, a social expectation of church going and church participation. And in that context in Canada in the 1950s, at least in English Canada, the churches that benefited the most from that expectation were the mainline Protestant churches, the kinds of churches that we looked at in our study, United, Anglican, Presbyterian, and Lutheran churches. Yeah. And so the people who went to church, most of them in English Canada went to those churches. When you move into the 1960s and beyond, due to larger changes in the society, as well as some changes in the churches themselves, that kind of commitment to involvement in the church and to church going begins to erode quite substantially among the population at large. And then the churches that are hit the hardest by that are the ones that have benefited the most from the social expectation in the past. And so looking at the churches today in those denominations, what we found is that there are certain characteristics that are necessary to really attract and hold on to people who are going to be committed to and participate in your local church. And in fact, the churches that are doing the best of that look more like evangelical or conservative Protestant churches rather than their fellow mainline Protestant churches that tend to be declining.
Mm-hmm. And so if you were to, again, thinking against part of the reality of both in Canada and other parts of the Western world, sort of the reality of sort of decline and decay that is often the case in a post-Christendom society. But having studied these churches, where's the hope for Protestantism in at least in Canada, but probably will relate to other parts of the Western world too? Do you come away feeling discouraged, or do you see places for hope for the church in the West these days?
Well, I think one encouraging thing to come out of this study is that there are some of these growing churches, even in denominations that as a whole are in really severe and sustained decline. Yeah. It took some looking to find them, I'm going to be honest. There aren't a lot of them, but they do exist. So it is possible, even in a mainline Protestant context, for a church to attract people, to hold on to people, and to grow over time. So that's encouraging, I think, for people in those churches. The other thing that can be encouraging is many people in the church in Canada and in other Western countries have acquired the idea that it's not possible to sort of hold to your core beliefs as a Christian church and still be relevant to society, right? So there's this theory that has been put out there both at a popular level and an academic level that if a church wants to continue to remain relevant in a secular society, it kind of needs to water down or back away from its traditional core beliefs. And what we've found, and this agrees with a lot of other research that's been done, is that just simply isn't the case. In fact, if anything, it's the opposite. That these churches that are very much sticking in these kind of traditional core beliefs that they have are doing really well. And so for people who believe those things and want to continue to promote those things in a Canadian context today, this is encouraging news.
Yeah, well, this study is a fascinating study, and those of you who are have maybe not seen it, again, if you go online and look up "Theology Matters" in the review of religious research, you can find the study online. I know that you're going to be publishing more things in the future based on the findings of this study, and it's a very worthwhile investment of time to to check out the research that Kevin and his colleagues have done. I just want to thank you today for being with us and just giving us a taste and some initial insight into some of those things. And I look forward to seeing more of the research as it comes out in the months ahead.
Thanks, Lee.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. Thanks for joining us today. We'll look forward to seeing you again on the next edition of the Roundtable.